we are starting where we left off with Van Gogh. Left the painting exactly where it was. My final touch of blue was the last thing I did last week, which is where I kind of want to start today. It is fully dry. That's 1 week untouched. And we are going to look at a few different effects that maybe Van Gogh didn't use as much, but that you as acrylic or oil painters can use for effect as a beautiful layering, glossing technique. So the first thing is I'm going to go to my palette. And I did have some colors here that I was using, didn't want to toss them out. So I'm going to go ahead and begin to set up my palette. So let's go ahead and start there. And I'm going to start with some cadmium yellow light. I'm going to go ahead and move my cadmium yellow deep hue just right next to it. And once again, we're looking at how do I select my palette? Do I have somewhat of a strategy? As I look at the image, and I'm just going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger as we set up our palette. So I know I'm going to need a lot of white. So I'm going to make sure I have that on there. As far as yellow goes, well, it's in the greens and I need to yellow some greens. How much of it? Am I going to mix all of my greens or am I going to add a green to my palette as well? How I set up my palette according to the subject that I'm painting, you want to start that planning, that strategy, and not just put all different colors on your palette. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go around the color wheel and we're going to see. Obviously, we're going to need yellow, we're going to need red, and we're going to need blue. I could see that we're not going to need a lot of red. That's just the one basic difference here. We're going to need to warm up a few things. This is overall a cooler picture. Some of the blues get a little warmer, and that's about it. So I'm going to tint, I'm going to mix some of that red into the blue to get a little bit of that violet warming feel to some of those blues. So my big question today is, what about the greens and the blues? So as I move around, I am going to, because it is a cooler painting, and what I mean by cooler, the temperature, warmer, cooler. This has, because of the blues and the greens, it's a nice, I mentioned it last week, analogous, using colors that are next to each other. So in this case, the blue and the green, and not a lot of complementary contrast, meaning if we had oranges to compete with the blue or reds to compete with the green to complement them, it would be a completely different picture. Here we have blue and green, which are right next to each other on the color wheel, so it's analogous. They're like cousins, they're family. So I'm going to go with the cooler red, in this case alizarin crimson, not a lot of it. And just in case we need a touch, because I'm not sure, I'm going to add quinacridone magenta, which is almost a violet. Always have to have it. This is personal for me. I always want burnt umber on my palette, especially if I need a black. If I need to create a gray or a black, I don't use a lot of black. I mix it with burnt umber and any of my blues. And we're going to do a little bit of that today as well, just so you can get a better feel of color theory and how you want to set yourself up for your color mixing. Having a black in your palette is not something you shouldn't do. You should consider it. Knowing which black and why is important. So ivory black is a little cooler, Mars black is a little warmer, and the way you can push that black, unless you want your paintings to have that dark, matte, flat black feel, knowing that you can mix your own is going to give you lots of versatility. And we're going to prove that today. So burnt umber. From here, I'm going to go into my violets or blues. So I'm going to start. And I'm going to do this just to prove something today, just to show you. If you have any doubts, any questions, where do I go? How do I begin? I'm going to start with ultramarine, which happens to be my warmest blue. I'm going to go to Cobalt Blue and put that right over here. I could add, I have it in my tool. Notice that I use it a lot actually. It's a cerulean blue, which is closer to a primary blue, but you can see already the difference between these blues. This one looks black on your screen. This one looks blue. This one begins to look, wow, it's kind of like a sky blue, but you could definitely see how it's closer to the green than the red. Between this one and this one, you could see, oh yeah, this one's definitely closer to the green. This one, definitely closer towards the red. And we're going to see what happens when you have those. And I'm going to add one extra one. Not that you have to have it, but it is another. It goes further. And I just want to prove a point. This is a Cobalt Teal color. Somewhat of a turquoise, close, very close to your blue-greens. And from here, what I want to do is this. I want to grab a brush, a paper towel, and what I want to do is just with the little Gamsol. I should get a little bit of cleaner. Fill that up. How do I know, or how do I begin to know and get a good, true sense of what these colors and how to navigate my color palette? One easy, good way to do this is to tint your colors. It kind of reveals the true potential of the color in light. So the white acts as light and obviously lightens the color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab just a touch of Gamsol. I'm going to pull this just so you can see it a little bit better on my palette. So when I do that, you get a better sense. Okay, yeah, it's a big pile of blue here, but now that I puddle it just a little bit, when I bring a tiny, tiny touch of white, I could just begin to mix, and there it is. There's something about the reveal of a tint of every color that gives you just a better sense on how you can use that color. I'm going to do that for, now I want to make sure my brush is clean. Although going from blue to blue, it's not going to affect it as much as any other color because the values of these colors are so close. I'm going to just drag that a little bit, stretch it, pull in just a tiny bit of white, not too much, and just do a little mix. Can you see the difference? Can you begin to see the actual difference from this blue to this blue? So we're working with ultramarine, and now we have cobalt. And look at what that color does when you bring in light, in this case, white. Now, just from here, can you begin to see, can you begin to favor which one should be in your painting? How am I going to get closer to the actual colors that I see on my subject, on my reference? Well, the only way is getting to know your colors. I say this all the time. How do we get to know our colors? Well, we test them. We press them. We push them. We pull them towards the white with combinations. I hope you could see. And it comes through. It comes through in the camera. I could see that on my screen. But in person, right here, live, it is impressive. All the inspiration that color can bring. Like, I'm ready to paint as soon as I see this happening. And where it could go, it is a great way to get you giddy, ready to just begin mixing and experimenting with all these colors. That is, in fact, what is beautiful about painting. Realizing that you have all of this potential. So here are 4 examples of blue and how every single one is going to drive you in a very specific direction. Now, this is something that I highly recommend. And this happens to be done, I happen to use a different color because it's for portraiture. So replace this orange, and it's a cadmium orange. Replace it for a blue. Any of these blues that we just used here. You could pick your ultramarine, and then you begin to mix a chart. Now this is on canvas, just a canvas sheet, where the pure hue, the pure color right out of the tube goes here, and then you begin to mix it little by little all the way to white. You begin to mix it little by little all the way to black, and then mixtures of gray, which is the chroma. So you have the value, saturation, you have the chroma, and then you have the shades of that color. And just looking at that color by itself here, if I were to cover everything, and you just see that tiny little corner, you miss out all this potential. Are you telling me that this color or this shade of color comes from here? How would I have ever known that? Well, creating charts like this and experimenting and color mixing to create pages and pages or sketchbooks of this type of work, where you're only focused and only thinking about ratios and one or two colors at a time, is how you're going to really get to know your colors best and fastest. So I do this for every single color, or every new color. This happens to be a new color, that's why it's a recent one. And like I said, what you get out of it is a lot of knowledge. As a reference, when I'm looking, just having this around, it pulls me somewhere always. Ooh, I want to be here. I know how to get there immediately. So it's a great reference tool, a great map, and also a great inspiration tool. Okay, so we're here. Now I have variations. So remember, I just added a little bit of white here. And I have these variations of temperatures that I could also mix. Did you know we could do that? We could mix a little bit of ultramarine blue with cobalt blue. And in that same ratio, one of these is going to be a little more powerful. Let's go ahead and stretch it. Are you telling me we could mix blue with blue? Well, I guess, yeah, that makes sense. And I'm going to get, believe it or not, look at that, a cooler version of still blue of that ultramarine blue. And I could make this a little more cobalt biased type of blue. And I could do that with every combination, every mixture. Now, what happens when I begin to mix three blues? Now, that might be a little too much. I'm getting a little too far. But what I'm trying to say here is, the further away you get from just using the color directly out of the tube, the better you're going to feel about your colors, your painting. They're going to be yours. So from here, we're going to go to the greens. And very quickly, I just want to kind of set up my palette so I'm not having to move away from my focus as I'm painting specific areas and focusing on shapes and coming back to my palette and having to mix the color to then go back to the canvas and, oop, wait, where was I? What was I thinking about? Lose your place. So what I want to do is somewhat prepare my palette, and this is a way a lot of artists work. You spend a lot of time on the palette, looking at your subject, preparing your colors. And how much of them? I'm going to need a lot of blue, but I want to see what kind of green. And using a little bit of intuition here, I'm really going to look closely at, is it a cool or warm green? How do I do that? Because green is supposed to be cool, and it's actually one of the coolest colors on the color wheel. So if it's going towards yellow, it means it's warming up. If it's going towards the blue, it means it's warming up. But how far, it's also, it's going to matter. Because if it's going way too much into the blue, then at some point it begins to warm up again because it's getting closer to red. So think about all these things in terms of distance from one color to the other in your color wheel. And let's start with ultramarine. So I'm just going to touch a tiny bit of ultramarine. I'm going to have a more yellow blue with ultramarine blue. And immediately I see that this is far away from the greens that I'm looking for. Are there some yellow greens that could get nearby? Yes, some of those tips, like right in the middle of the flower base, you see it's almost yellow, but it has a tint of kind of a brownish feel to it. Let's go ahead and pull a little more ultramarine blue and create sort of a spectrum from that yellow green to a darker bluish green. And I want to get a good sense of the temperature. Am I going to reach? And notice that, nope, it doesn't do it. It's a little too earthy because there is a little bit of red in the ultramarine blue. It tends to get grayer or browner. And we need to know that. That's the color bias in your pigment. So let's go to the cobalt blue. So let's grab another bit of yellow here. And we're going to go with just a touch of cobalt blue. Mix that. Immediately you see a little bit of a cooler feel. So this is too cool for those lighter areas of yellow-green. But let's see if I bring a little more blue and make that a darker version. Immediately I begin to see that, yes, this is the kind of, I called it minty, cool green. And one way, just like we did with the blues, that we find out, we're going to bring just a touch of white and tint that green. And I see, there it is. I think that is the green we're looking for. Now, it could be a little bit bluer, a little bit yellower. Can you see that? So this is the tint. The lighter, I'm going to do it on the other side as well so you could see what happens to the yellow-green of cadmium yellow and cobalt blue when I add white to it as well. Is it going to get us near the other side? What I was looking for. And I could begin to see that it could work. Maybe a little touch of yellow. I went a little too far with the white. So bring in just a little bit of yellow back to it. Ooh, too much maybe. I could begin to see that, yeah, maybe that could work as my light on that green. So a combination of these right here, I think it's going to work. Just to clear all doubts, what if you mixed? Now again, if you have these colors in your palette, why not? Since I have it here, I'm going to test it. Bring in a little more of this cadmium yellow. And I'm going to see what happens with this cerulean. Obviously, it's going to be way cooler. So a little bit of cerulean blue. It should be even cooler. But is it going to have that minty feel to it as well? A little more cerulean blue. And we're going to need a lot of it. So immediately I'm noticing that the staining power of that cerulean blue, the yellow is competing with it right back. But you could see, once again, it gets a little bit earthier. It gets a little bit, I don't want to say neutralized. It isn't. It's just less vibrant than that cobalt. That cobalt has a punch. And I'm going to tint it just to see. A little more accuracy. So there's 3 combinations of green. And I hope you could see them. This one being a little more earthier. I call it earthier, browner, grayer. This one mintier, cooler. And this one, once again, more neutral in the sense of compared to these. But very rich too. And it's one that could work. You may be seeing this as too yellow. And again, you can really reach that spectrum. But when you tint that color, that's when you know. Now, you will develop a sense of color the more and more you practice with it, where you won't need to tint it. You'll see it immediately. And when you've done this type of exercise, you'll know it before you even think about it. You already know exactly where to go. So decision-wise, I look at my blues, and I see that it's going to be a little bit between cobalt and ultramarine, maybe a mixture of both, and playing towards the tint light side of it, with the shade maybe being a little bit into the violet, bringing in a little bit of red. So which red? Let's go ahead. If I'm saying cobalt blue is going to be my predominant color for the flowers, I'm going to go ahead and bring just a little bit of cobalt blue right here. And I'm going to go with, make sure your brush is clean. Now we're switching. I had a lot of yellow in my brush from the previous mix. I want to make sure you either switch brush or really, really clean out so it doesn't pollute this new mix. And I'm going to go to that quinacridone magenta. And I'm just barely going to touch it, barely, to see what kind of darkening. Immediately it darkens. You could see that the cobalt just went dark. So I could definitely use this. And I'm going to show you exactly where. If you're looking at your reference, there's an area right here where it's going to get a little bit darker. And it is that dark blue, almost violet. So for my shadows or the shades in lots of these areas here, where I see that volume receding, going a little bit back up here in this area. Once again, looking at your reference, I hope you can see what I'm looking at. There's going to be certain areas of dark blue-violet, and I think this is so accurate here. I'm just got carried away. I'm using it. But I wanted to show you what that color would look like when I tint it. So here on my palette again, little residue of it. There it is. So you could see how this color, just with a touch of red, warmed it up just enough that it could serve, and also as that outline that I see in some of these flowers. Okay. Let me grab a new paper towel and start mixing those colors. So I am going to bring a few of these colors, make it playful. You know, some of this turquoise into some of these greens. We didn't do that mix. What happens if I bring in a little bit of yellow and mix it with this turquoise? Oh my gosh, that's really, really punchy. Beautiful. And when I tint it, look at that. I think I just found, well, close. It's close. Maybe a little more cerulean. The color for my base. And I mean right here, which we're going to look at. We're going to look at how to figure out these colors, how to mix them, maybe a little tinted, and be able to really capture the color, the hue, and the shifting values, which overall these are very, very light. Next thing is you're going to want to keep your palette organized. So I'm going to show you something I use to mix my color. It's a palette knife. So much easier to clean. So when I'm going to mix a color, now that I know it's mostly cobalt blue with a touch of ultramarine, and in certain areas I'm going to bring in just a pinch of this quinacridone rose. I could have done more tests just to see if the color was, if I could find a better color by using alizarin. But it will become so intuitive that when you do these color mixes, I'm just wiping down this a little bit of that tint now that you saw it, so I can make more room for my future mixes. And I'm going to start with this Cobalt Blue. I'm just going to grab all of it, put it right here in the middle, touch it with a tiny bit of ultramarine. So the ratio here is like 90-10 maybe. So it's going to warm up that cobalt just a little bit. And I could see already that I'm going to need a lot more. So straight out of the tube, best way is to always keep it in its place and bring in little by little. Little by little. So another chunk. Now, because I don't have this color right out of the tube anywhere on my painting, if I were to find this, do I have Cobalt Blue on my canvas serving as that maybe dark shade? I think it's too cool. We're gonna find out that squinting at your reference. Very carefully, I'm gonna bring in just little by little bits of white, and I'm gonna tint this entire puddle of paint. And what I want to reach is that sense, that color of the overall, as not just each individual flower, but like the overall color that stands out. And you notice that it's really light. Now, as far as strategies go, usually you want to start from dark, work your way towards the light. We are going to do that, but I want to get a good sense of, as I mix this color, because it is predominant, have a little variation in it as well. So I could have a little bit of this, set it aside, and continue adding white to the other, more than half of it. And you see how I can have two of them now? I think I'm beginning to feel it. I see it's getting close. Just a little more. And you could keep adding white all the way until this becomes white. That'll be a lot of white that we have to add to this for it to get all the way to white. So basically what we're doing is we're lowering the value. We're making it lighter and lighter and lighter, a tiny bit at a time. I want to make sure I get really, really close, more than the color, to the value. So it's going to be darker than the background, I know that, but it's going to be lighter, way lighter than those darkest areas. And I think from this point right here, I feel comfortable. Pull all of this and just have it there. Just test it. We did, and that's matching what I did last week. So I'm pretty confident that that's the one. With the sense that always I can pull in just a little extra white and bring it directly to the canvas and have it mix on the canvas as I explore the types of brush strokes that Van Gogh used. And notice how that's beginning to work right there. Okay, let's go to our greens. Now I'm going to clean this up a little bit, make it more, little roomier for our green mixes. And since those two colors are going to be, for right now, my main focus, I think I have enough. I will most likely have to mix lots more, but it's going to be one step at a time. That should give me at least the first layer. Notice that Van Gogh pretty much laid down his paint and was done with it. So I'm going to use this cerulean blue right here, just to cool it a little bit extra. Although I know it was cobalt blue once again. So I'm going to use all of it. Mix those two. Make that cobalt blue just a little bit cooler. And this time, instead of white, or not yet, I'm going to begin to add yellow. You see how first it gets really dark. As we add more and more, what we're looking for, once again, is the value. So it's very, very light, and we know it's also tint of that color. So as far as temperature goes, need more yellow. So setting yourself up this way, you'll be doing like, I don't want to say 70-80% of artists do this, painters. Set up your palette first, then begin painting. Or paint as you go, which is the intuitive way. Let me just mix as I work through specific areas. Either or, both ways are right. It's you finding which is more convenient, more efficient. You want to consider also time. You could spend lots and lots of time mixing all of these colors. Now, if you're an acrylic painter, you have to work faster. You don't want to mix paints, let them sit and dry. So you're going to have to work with a different strategy. So I think figuring out how it works best, how it's more fun. For me, this is a lot of fun. Really studying, analyzing the color, having a good feel that, okay, allowing ideas to also pop in as I'm mixing the color. Because then you realize that the shapes that you're going to be mixing, just adding a little bit with my brush here, trying to get a feel for that minty green. What you realize is those shapes, whatever subject you're painting, what matters about those shapes and the accuracy of those shapes is the colors and the value of those colors that you will be applying to them. So I'm going to start with, since I started here with this green, I'm going to begin to add a little bit of medium. So this is painter's medium. You have lots of different vehicles. Liquid for oil painters. For acrylic painters, you have gels. So you have glazing mediums, very liquidy, very glossy. You have acrylic glazing liquids or matte, gels that are thicker. All these different vehicles that are going to allow you to thicken or thin your paint, also to make it dry faster or slower. With oils, pretty much the vehicles are going to be thinner or Gamsol, which are going to thin your paint, make it lighter, make it dry faster, or more oil. So linseed oils, safflower oils, stand oils, all different types of mixtures where your paint will be wetter, glossier. So I'm adding just a little bit of that medium, and I'm beginning to just play with this puddle, tinting little by little. Notice how I leave a lot of the general color still untouched. I will need that for variations. And I'm going to see if this is working. Now, as far as vehicle goes, I want to also see in terms of application. Selecting my brush, and I'm working with a round brush right now. Kind of applying a first general layer. Because my paint will be wet for a little bit, I am not afraid to just fill up the shape knowing that I could always come back with a little bit of just extra yellow and have the paint mix on the canvas. So this is one of those strategies where now you're considering color, value, technique of application, vehicles, and the overall look that you want, in case you want to create textures. You begin to see that little bit of yellow laying over that original minty green I laid down. There's a tiny bit of that blue, and it's that reflected. He's playing with that reflected light. So bringing in a little bit of blue over that green. And having them lay over, mix. Notice that I'm not brushing it in. So I'm not doing this. I don't want to mix as if it were a palette. What I want to do is allow the paint to really become something unexpected. Laying it down, having a good sense of, okay, there's going to be a little bit of color mixing from that original color that I laid down. But the more you one stroke it, the more you one and done it. What does that mean, one and done it? The more you focus on just one easy stroke, going with a little bit of ultramarine blue, I touched it in there. It feels warmer. Now I should be switching to a tinier brush for these very thin lines. And maybe a little variation in my vehicle as well. So you can see how this begins to give you all different types of possibilities of playing with that light shadow, beginning to consider edges. I feel like I want to bring in a little bit of yellow, and I'm going to tint it with a tiny bit of white. So it's that same yellow I applied early right here. And I just want to give it a little extra pop of light. So tinted it with a little bit of white. And just added one quick stroke of it. Going back to a little bit of darker original, that green we mixed, and putting it right next to it. So there we have yellows, greens, blues, tints of it. I will have to come over again and kind of enrich this. So what it's missing, I could see it, is those sharp dark lines that are splitting, creating that bit of variation there. So I'm going to go with a little more vehicle. I'm going to go right back to following that rule from thin to thicker, from lean to fat. So very lean, watered down paint that is then layered with thicker and thicker. So I'm going with a little bit thicker than my original layer here, but it's not ultra thick. So it's still a little bit thinned. Call it 1.5 steps up. And here I'm taking a little softer brush stroke. It's not, I want it to be kind of precise. I want it to be thin. I want to make sure these lines have that characteristic. and one that's ultra thin right here. So you begin to realize, what I choose in terms of color, the value of that color. What you realize is it comes down to brush strokes and the edges that those brush strokes create. So here I'm working with a little bit of the edge of the shape, and I'll come right back over it, kind of overlapping it just a little bit with a little bit of white. So it's not like a caricature. With a hard outline. You want those edges between the shapes of color to have something really, say something really strong. Let's grab another smaller brush that I'm going to keep with mostly white. And I'm going to bring it in right in here, right now. Show you how to kind of work that edge and then have it play with a little bit of soft mixing on the canvas to create. I want to point this out. Right here, you see a difference. Then this one right here, I hope you see that one. Hard, almost like a Sharpie outline right there so far. And I did put it intentionally because what I want to do is this. So I'm bringing in some white, or the other side of my shape, the edge that I'm trying to create here, and I'm rubbing it right against it. So I'm creating another line, but this time is not from the outside in, but from the inside out. And without having it blend too much, I'm just softening that edge. Now, when you really diffuse these edges, the softer and softer they get, well, then you get the Mona Lisa. That sfumaggio, they call it, which is smoky transitions where you can't tell where one color ends and the other one begins. Van Gogh did not, he wanted to show us and play with those colors. So there it is, and there's a little bit of blue tint coming right off of that as a shadow right in here. And you could see it right above here too. So depending on how much you want accuracy with this, you could get a little bit looser with that color. Bring a little more white. That got a little too harsh. And the other thing I wanted to show you is when we begin to use his type of brush stroke, which is that heavy impasto brush stroke, you want to show it. I'm going to go ahead and do that now, right in this area with, we know it's a white and it has just a bit of blue, probably just mixed from the way he was applying the paint, and really thick brush strokes that are, you have to just lay it down and let it be. So you're giving a little bit of direction. And as you look at his painting, you can actually see exactly where he started and where he ended with his brush stroke. What you don't want to do is blend it in all the way. You want to see these stacked, broken, sculpting basically. And you are going to use a little more paint, obviously, as it thickens. But don't just paint this whole thing white. Notice how I'm bringing in a little tiny tint of blue into that white. And I feel that there's a little bit of green, that minty green, that begins to happen right over on this area. So very delicately, it has to be ultra, ultra fine in terms of how light. Notice that the way I'm holding the brush. I should have shown you that earlier. Oops. If you're holding your brush like a pencil, you're not going to be able to do some of the brush strokes that you're going to want to do. You're going to see artists doing this. the way you hold your brush, and I would hope everyone would take a pause for a second and look at this at the screen. If you're holding your brush like this, the closer you are to the tip, this is called the tripod grip. Yes, you're going to have control, but you're going to have limited motion range. What you want to do is hold it on your index finger. This is for right-handed, left-handed. Index finger, thumb. And then just for support, you place your middle finger right next to your index finger. So this is the grip you want to do. Now you can grab it this short and still do that motion. But notice, just if you look at the tip of my brush, the back tip, notice how just with this little motion of my fingers here, notice how much range of motion I have. Now the further back I do this with the same grip, yes, I lose control, but the type of brushstroke that you can then apply is what you're looking for. So you see this, you see how I'm holding the brush? Go ahead and grab it, not too long. Obviously your posture, the way you're set up, if you're flat, this is going to be a lot harder. You would have to be standing. And ideally, you would want to be painting vertically. So your painting is facing you at parallel, basically. And then your arm has full range of motion. But this grip is crucial. Really, really practice this. And make this just an exercise in that. How you mix your colors and how you grab your grip to bring your brush stroke. Do it this way as much as you can. Oh, but I'm losing all control. But the more you practice it, the richer those brush strokes are going to get. Oh, but what about when I need the line? Practice it. The more you practice it, it's giving up a little bit of control, but reaping the rewards. And yeah, notice that I go from underhand to overhand. And you could still do the same type of motions. It's just a little how you have to place your hand, how you have to think about your elbow, shoulder, and mostly the wrist. Bringing more white. And I think we better got to get started with these flowers. So you'll see me do a lot of these variation of motions to apply the quality of brushstroke that I want to bring in. So notice mixing your paint, bringing over a little more, and I'm just going to touch up the most minimal amount. It stains it a lot, but I want to bring it almost to white. And just finish up this face. So it's a little bit of white with a little tint. You could see that tint of blue, hopefully, right there. And that's how you're going to create that volume. Now, some of that paint may kind of, like icing on a cake, and may stick up. So flatten your brush stroke. So make sure your grip is like this, but you're not angled, creating those little sticky, kind of like cone shapes of paint. You want to begin to really feel the volume of the actual object that you're trying to represent. So the roundness, the brushstroke should have that motion. Just a tiny bit of that rounding motion. Bringing a little bit of the green that actually begins to look like kind of aqua. And right here in this shaded area, you can exaggerate it just a little bit. Can you see that there? The shift from white with the tints of blue now with the green. And that green could always just play back a little bit more into the blue. Now it matters how you manage these tints, because they will also compete with the flowers. There we go. I think I'm done with my vase. It was that simple. Now I may revisit some of the outlines, some of the edges to create a little more contrast. But I kind of wanted to get this out of the way. As we move forward, it's going to give me a better feel because of color contrast. Having that white on my canvas is going to give me a better sense of the darker colors, those blues and violets we're about to bring. So here's another look. Notice the shifting. Notice the direction of the brush stroke. You see how I could kind of, even with that paint on there, I don't want to move them too much because once you lay down a brush stroke, it's a one of a kind in the universe. If you try to reorganize, fix it, you lose it forever. There's no way you could get that exact combination of brush strokes back. And as you begin to move them, maybe you'll get new ones and maybe they'll be better. But the ones you have there, once you have them and you want them, you're running the risk. As soon as you begin overbrushing, I call it, you're running more of a risk than the reward. So learn to live happy with those decisions. They are like little miracles, those brush strokes that just whoops. And the paint, you begin to have a sense that it is alive. It is alive. And it moves and it swirls and it does things and it kind of sings right back at you. Where you should appreciate it, like, ooh, beautiful. So much so that we could give them names. You know, this type of brushstroke or that type of brushstroke. Okay, so I'm tinting a little bit lighter just to use this paint. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to a smaller brush. Now I do have this brush that I'm using. It's a medium number 3, a flat number 3. And I'm going to use some of that overall color, trying to map out, begin to see just the base color. You could see that, how I'm doing that there. And where I see some of this, I'm going to go ahead and use this color. I'm not using any vehicle right now. I'm just kind of scraping the paint on to create a basic layer. Really want to show you this. So areas like this where I could begin to identify some of these petals, flowers. I want to bring in just, and you see how it's scrapey, it's not clear edged. It's just acting as a color that I could work over, lighter or darker. Notice the direction of the brushstroke as I'm applying it. It begins to have the sense of convex, concave. In order for me to rework lights and darks into it. And that is what it should look like. I'm going to give you a quick little peek into what this would look like after the fact. So right here, bring in just tinted white, mostly white, just a touch of the blue. And it's because I see a highlight almost of white coming in right here. I want to have it mix just a bit with that blue. I don't want it to be fully white. There's color mixing. And maybe I should consider some vehicle at this point where I could see dabs of paint. And they get thinner and smaller as we get just a little bit darker. But you want to see that clear, intentional brushstroke and build up from the basic general color, touch it with light, and then ultimately with shadows. So there's There's some light, shadows, starting to build up. Where we want to get this is to a place where I'm going to grab some ultramarine, mix a little more, just touch it with that magenta. And I do want to bring my vehicle out now, more and more. I'm going to use that painter's medium and just have it over here next to my palette. Soften it up. Make sure your brush is clean between so you don't blend or mix the colors. Especially when you're tinting. Paintings like this where you touch white, you should have a separate brush so you don't bring lighter colors where you want to have darker colors. And I'm going to go ahead and just begin to draw that shade in. Just work this area over here. But as I work lights and shadows, how you saw them, I'm going to grab that small brush once again, my line brush, and I'm going to do some of those edges. So here the strategy of what goes first, the background, the foreground, you need to begin to plan it out. So once I do some of these outlines, it's going to be a little harder for me to go back and rework some of the backgrounds if I haven't. So from the outline, make sure your background, what is under, should be first. What comes over that should be last. But I just wanted to show you really quick how we begin to build up a little bit of outline. And we could go back and just soften that outline and mix that color to create a better kind of uniform feel and more of a petal. Having that petal look. At this point, I'm thinking I should have a green brush that I'm going to work with greens. So I don't have to clean in between. And I'm going to just work these shapes. So I can move to blue or white as I need to without having to switch over so much. And it'll also make it a little bit faster. And it is a technique that was used, and most people do that. You have 2-3 brushes for light, warm colors, 2-3 brushes for dark, cool colors, or warm and variations, so you can move a little bit faster. I want to see what's going to happen over here. I want to start bringing it just inside. Some of these bigger shapes. So going a little bit back to like that structural. In a way, kind of back to drawing some of these shapes in. Thinking of my brush stroke. I know it's a very generic, uniform looking color right now. But remember, I could bring in my blue, and I'll do that right now. Bring in a little bit of that outline, fresh. There's a little curve right there. And a nice curve. Moving back along. And then bring a little bit of a lighter, and whether you see it, darker green, lighter green, and soften up that edge. And this must have been the way that he set up, most likely, the outline and the inner colors, and the way they mixed. I hope you could see that. There's a nice outline here, so setting up that color, bringing out the outline. And all the answers are there. When you look closely at this painting, you could see all the evidence, even the motion, the decision of how to bring in specific color mixes, and brush strokes in different areas. This is my smallest brush, but it is easier to clean. I have some of this pre-mixed warm green here, and I'm going to bring it just around the edges. Now here I begin to do something that when I lay down a brush stroke and it picks up paint that is on my canvas, I want to lay down that brush stroke and then clean my brush in between. So I have this old t-shirt here, a towel where you're wiping your brush, so you could bring back, I'm going to bring in a nice light, it's not white, but tint of that yellow, green. And I'm going to make this right here. So I'm rotating the brush in order to get all the color I loaded up into it as it mixes with what was on the canvas. The other part of it is reworking a little bit of that background. When I begin to add more and more of this blue, somehow the background looks more and more yellowish. And in my image, it almost has more of a pinkish hue to it. So I could do a little bit of that. But let's go ahead and back to the strategy. Go ahead and fill up most of my blue and begin to really draw those shapes in. And again, this is how I'm going to go about it. You can, I mentioned, if it's easier for you to see and not lose your place working in different quadrants, meaning you want to work this area and work it until it's finished so you can move through the painting. That's one way, and it is efficient, believe it or not. There's strategies that work best for different types of, I guess it's personalities. Some of us want to work a little bit faster and don't have that type of patience. Some have that absolute patience that could spend and see it beforehand in a way. And be able to interpret and stay focused on one area at a time for a long time until it's done. Some of us need to be jumping from here to here, and that's the way minds work. So I've seen that as well. I just went from here to here. Why? I don't know. It's just how my mind. Now, if you don't have a strategy, you should be thinking about, okay, why did I just go from here to here? Should I just continue? And it is the beauty. It is the beauty of all the types of decisions that you're making with your color mixing, brush techniques, how you're going to bring it about, where you're going to place it, mixing a little more, and I do have lots and lots of this color, just as you can see here. I can make it a little darker, a little lighter, add a little more medium. You can green it up a little, so tint it with a little bit of this green, whether it happens accidentally or not, and just lay down lots and lots of these shapes. And the looser, sometimes the looser you get, the richer, the more organic and natural feel to it. But there's a level of caution, of kind of know-how, where you have the confidence to do that, and you can execute it confidently. If you're too tentative, you want to kind of find a way to loosen it up. where you're not doing it casually or risking too much, but being able to handle the paint, handle the brush, and not lose track of the most important thing, how you're seeing it. And what is it that you're seeing? Because it all comes down to that. Observation. Am I seeing? What am I seeing? Am I really looking? And can I simplify what I'm looking so I can build it in an interesting way? Reimagine it? There we go. Lots of mixtures of blue here. I don't want to lose my place. Now, you may be saying, like, wait a minute. What's he doing over here? That does not look like the shapes. I'm thinking of one overall shape. And yes, there's greens in there and blues. So I'm trying to really pace myself. And remember, I said this is a first layer of color that I'm going to really just come over with lighter or darker touches in order to just finish it in one pass. So here, just variations of that blue. I could see them clearer now as I make mental notes. Ooh, when I get here, notice how that nice rich violet. So I kind of begin to plan that ahead. So it's kind of seeing it and then re-seeing it, rediscovering it as you move along through it. Or seeing parts of it in a different way with a little more clarity. I love that word. Clarity. And that's something, it's a good thing to seek. How do you find it? Sometimes when you look for it too much, you can't see it, and it's right there, right under your nose. Just take a deep breath. Ah, there it is. It's been there all along. What was it? Just simplified. Most of the time, the answer is very simple. And makes you think of less is more. Is that true? Right now I'm going with very, very less. And I'm really liking this painting the way it's going. And it's about to get very, obviously, more and more descriptive. But I love to see or begin to kind of have a glimpse of feeling what he was feeling. And I should mention, completely different experience when you're working from a photo than when you're working from life. If you had a pot of flowers right in front of you with a nice window lighting that you can reach out and touch, basically. Highly, highly recommend that experience. Setting up anything. If you've never done that before, I always recommend start with an egg. Put an egg right in front of you. Take some black and white paint. Well, unless you pick a brown egg. And then just paint that. More reading of shapes as we get more and more refined. And the lines get thinner. The shapes get more complex. But our reading of it begins to get sharper and sharper. Now I could begin to mix. Notice that I just grabbed some yellow and I'm making this area here a little yellow or green. So I begin to, because I have my colors very simple, set up, I could actually shift, and I'm using my green brush right now, from darker, I could even add some blue to this if I needed it darker, greens, back to my pool where I added some yellow, and have a little variation of greens going on already as I continue to set up my shapes. So I don't have to come back later. In the one pass here, I could actually give it definition. There's the outline, there's the shape, and now there's the color. And the color's already more accurate. The values and the color families, very accurate already. Coming over. Now considering my brush, right now I don't want to get too sharp, too detailed. And in a way, I don't want to get detailed until the very, very end, if at all. I'm going to grab some of this middle yellow, minty yellow that we had ready for this one right here. Just to see the shift in the color of this leaf. I'll have to maybe revisit a little more of this earth. Yellow green. Moving in this direction. And yes, it's looking very solid color. This one has a little more blue in it. So we could touch a little blue into it. And you could see how, yep, that is how he navigated those colors, because I could see the shift, and we're very, very close from the original color mix to actually capturing that look. A lot more green. And now this is getting smaller and smaller. So there's going to be some mixing when this paint touches. And I'm going to begin to think of those edges. So you want some of these edges, some of these shapes. This is what's going to make or break our painting here, where we overdo it or underdo it. And having a good sense of how I'm going to get through those negative spaces, meaning what's in and around behind the shapes. And breaking them down as they get simpler. I'm sorry, more and more complex. Definitely not simpler. I guess you could say, in a way, the way you're seeing it, the way you're breaking it down, for some of us, it could get simpler. A little more blue. I'm going to go with ultramarine. And darken just a little bit of green here, more. So you see how this green is becoming a little bit darker and earthier. And the way I see it, it's right in here. Just a punch of darker green. And there's one that goes right underneath, but it's mostly linear. So it's going to be done with the outline as well. Going back to that mint here. Let's wipe this down a little bit. Grab some of this teal. Touch it. And just added a little more vehicle for some of these lines happening right here. And there we go. I think I'm done with this brush. Just double checking a few areas where I'm bringing a little bit of this cooler green, mixing it into some of that green I laid down already. some empty, some still. I mentioned this last week. I want to be able to see at the end of my painting, I want to be able to save some of that background. Remember how we started it up with that burnt umber? Some of that warm blank canvas, call it, but it's a underpainted canvas coming through, seeping through here and there. And when you look really, really close at this painting, the place you see it most evident is in the handle, the back of the handle of the vase. It's not painted, it's the canvas. But between some of these flowers, some of those yellow-orange pops, which is the only complementary color you see, is where we see it. So I'm leaving some of these brush strokes open and scratchy like this on purpose. Very careful not to want to outline all of it and seal it. You want to be able to see and let some of that come through. Okay, so smaller brushes. They're clean. I'm going with a small round, small flat, and a fine liner for those tiny little brush strokes. I almost want to have two of them so I don't have to switch back and forth from, although most of it is going to be, for the first part, dark. I'm going to go to that darker mix, that ultramarine. Really never had to bring in my burnt umber or black, but I am going to touch in some areas. So before we go there, I wanted to just revisit some of these. And I'm going to enlarge them so you could see all the way how it's not exactly outline, it's just wiggly variations of dark, medium, and light. Variations of that color, the richness of the brushstroke, and the thickness of the paint. And remember what I just said about the canvas showing through? You could see in some of them, the paint does not cover all of it. So how you manage the contrast between the shapes, those darker shapes, the outline of some of these, considering whether it's dark or the medium value or just the pops of light. And the way that plays with the background as well. So bringing some of that. And notice that some of the blue, it's not always blue. There's a little bit of greening in that blue, meaning there's tints of green or even green right over it. And you begin to see some pops of what seems like an orangey color, brownish orange color in the center, in the middle of those flowers. So, and it's tiny, but it's crucial. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on. And I'm going to want to try to give you close-ups of it as much as I can, but without you losing track of where I am. So for example, if I started here, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go with, in this case, I need to mix ultramarine blue, have plenty of it. I could test how that's going to work with, obviously, my vehicle, but also I have an alizarin crimson that I set up and see if that's going to work. So what I want to do is I want to zoom in a bit into my reference and begin to just get a sense of, do I have the right value? Wipe this brush down, mix it with the little preset color here, and just give it a variation. So bring some of that from here into here. Were you guys able to see that? So it's not all just one uniform color. There's three variations of that color. There's a little bit of light coming from that color. So I'll bring it back to my palette and you can see that, how that was done. But as I come down here, I'm going to sort of go for a little bit of a darker touch. It's not exactly an outline, just a line, and then another line right here. A curve. So I'm beginning to operate. I'm beginning to see all the darks first, and I'm kind of drawing them in. I'm shifting from ultramarine to cobalt. So it's not all the same. From there, I'm going to go to my medium value. It's a mixture of that cobalt ultramarine, also with a little bit of vehicle. but it is going to be lighter. And I'm just going to go ahead and brush it on, touch it. You should be able to happily live with that. Now that's too dark. So I'm going to bring in a little bit of lighter mix once again. Bring it over. Now your vehicle is going to be very important here. Whether you are using any or not, the thickness, the consistency of your paints, as you focus on the value changes. Remember, right here I'm working with pretty much 3, but from those 3, I could actually begin to introduce a mixture of those 3 to create maybe a 4th. And now remember, what I have overall is that original first layer that I added, what serves as my background for the flowers now. Notice that I added a little bit of turquoise there. And I want to eat up some of this line here to not make it so thick and so obvious. So how I manage that, I think it's going to be the most important look. And just shifting that and paying attention to your brush strokes. Tiny little dab of white right there. A couple of light dabs right down here. And a lot of white on this one at this end. And you want to be able to contrast, contrast, contrast. So a little bit of white and, yes, complemented by a little bit of dark. Tiny little thin line right here. And I'm going to work my way all the way through, flower by flower. And the more you fall in love with your subject, the better results you're going to have. So the more time you give, and it's not, I don't mean like time you have to spend hours and hours, but the amount of attention. If you feel like you're rushing through, you're not really giving each petal of each flower its due, then that's what it's going to look like. But if you break it down, what you're seeing on screen right now, it literally is what you should be focusing on. Painting shapes. Notice how this little shape that I'm about to paint here, I'm going to try to match it. See if you guys can pick out where I am. And how it gets a little bit lighter. Thin edge right there. And then it gets way darker right in here underneath. So a combination of how you put these shapes together, how they get lighter and darker, and that beautiful back and forth. And I know it's a little bit difficult. I know it's a little bit difficult with me talking in your ear, because this should be meditative. This should be just zone out and really going for a trip inside a flower vase. A nice little vacation. With a great experience. What's left from it in the end is that the experience of, oh wow, I dove in. I was really deep into those flowers, and I could see everything. And some people call it kind of a communion with nature, meaning you become one. You lose the sense of where the flower ends and you begin. And some of you may be saying, well, that sounds crazy. But it is a difficult thing to explain until you experience it. And it is, first thing is losing the sense of time. When 2 hours went by and you're, oh my gosh, it felt like 5 minutes, 10 minutes. That means you were there. Just beginning to read not just the subject, but the key to this when it comes to color theory, the way he worked his brushstroke, it's the light, the handling of the light on this subject. And then how you decide every single little stroke of color, the technique, the shape of it. Let's go ahead, zoom out, and begin to see what that's looking like. Ooh, I like it. I really like it a lot. Makes you want to slow down a little bit. And enjoy the moment. Realizing that's all we have. Collections of moments. Beautiful moments. This is one of them. Make them one of them. Now I begin to see the darkest. Almost it would seem as black, but it is just a really dark, deep purple, let's call it, or violet. So I'm going to bring in more of that alizarin crimson, make sure there's no white tint in it. And you could see them right in here where this ends. There's some petals that have that really dark, and notice how that looks black right there. That's going to be these are going to be some of my darkest touches. Definitely want to thin it down with a little vehicle. You see how that it's a deep violet. It's not black. Even there, you can still see. I would have to tint it. But trust me, it is a deep, call it a dark burgundy. But it reads as black when you combine it with this. And it will begin to pop a little bit of that violet that we were talking about earlier. Where and how much of it, it's going to be a key. I don't want to overdo it. And as the flowers get smaller and smaller, the lines get sharper and sharper. So your technique should match that. It's also a matter of how close to the shape is very important. Color is very important. The sharpness of some of these lines, I've been mentioning it. When you deal with that edge, figuring out what that edge does, the sharpness of it, and the color of it does to the overall, it's going to be a key factor for this one. Focus it just on different types of brushstroke. So I got to bring in some blue here. Notice what I'm going to do. I'm going to go over this green and just bring in some extra blue here. Mixing this color. There was a blade of grass that was not supposed to be there. So it happens. And now we bring it back. Bring back a little lighter blue. And if you have to, you can wipe it down or wait till it's dry to paint over it. But as you can see, the way I navigate, the way I decide to move in and out of shapes, how much I deal with the variation of the brush stroke, shifting my brushes from medium, and these are 3 small, but from the small to the smallest, as I also make decisions with color, shifting color, value of the color, all these little decisions. That's where we're going to be. And I see myself through next week. So I hope you get a good sense of, I get it. It is an exercise in observation. What that means is, as I navigate, as I go through all these parts, am I really looking at what I'm supposed to, the way I'm supposed to? What is the way I'm supposed to be looking at this right now? Answer, always in the simplest way. Find the way you can simplify what you think you're saying into smaller, simpler things. And if you have to really zoom it out and just focus on color, line, shape, then you must do that. And I'm just navigating once again from petal to petal, looking at the edge, looking at the changing values. And I'm beginning to play with just that, the brush stroke, how I can thicken it and begin to add little character to each individual brush stroke. And beginning to find more and more accuracy in my original take of my drawing. I could go back into some of these greens and add a little bit deeper green, more yellow, or more blue, or rework some of those edges, some of those outlines, redefining the shape. I have a feeling I'm going to hang this painting in my house, because it's going to be a lot of work. It's been a lot of work so far, and it does feel like it's going to be a lot more if you go flower by flower, if you break it down into kind of a system. Work the outline, work the mid-tone, and then work the light. It looks like we could have almost a formula going that could make it go a little bit faster. But you want to be careful. You want to work fast, but not rush. You want to work energetic, but make sure you have the right pace. How do you know what the right pace is? It'll show in your quality of brushstroke. It'll show in your quality of color selection. And we all have a different pace. In my household, we definitely have a different pace, especially when we're going somewhere and we say we're leaving at 10 a.m. and it's 10:30 and somebody's still putting on their shoes. So different paces. While the other person's sitting outside in the car already for 15 minutes. That kind of pace. So sometimes, yeah, I admire a slow, steady pace instead of a rushed one. But sometimes you have to get a feel for how the energy is flowing and bring that energy into your painting. So I'm about to have a lot of fun here where I'm going to rework some of the background. And notice that I did if you could see here, the color of the background. It actually shows best here. I'm going to rework some of this tinted white, and I tinted it with just a tiny bit of that cerulean blue that I had left. And maybe it had a little bit of cobalt blue in it as well. But I want to make sure I just rework. The reason I'm doing this is to introduce and rework some of those outer edges. So this over here, once I go from here through these edges and begin to build up that background, I call this area here finished. And as I continue moving around, I could thin or begin to thicken that paint, because in the background you also see some of those, for the most part, horizontal brush strokes that are kind of building around some of these flowers and making them pop out even further. And I will take a little bit of a step back to make sure if I should continue with a little bit of that, because now it looks cooler. So I might, before I get too far, I might make it warmer with a little bit of kind of a pinkish hue. And actually that would be smart, because it could do something to that green that I haven't thought about. And it is kind of what I read in the painting as I see it. So it may be an issue of just the photograph, the reference, and how that could actually work. One way would be to test it. So it would be more of a warmer red with a lot of white. I'm going to go ahead and do that right over here. Just tiniest touch of alizarin crimson. And you could see how that warmed it up just a bit. And whether I'm working with the right medium, just add a tiny little drop. I'm going to go ahead and bring it over here. And I like it. Immediately like it. So just that quick test tells me, yep, that's the color background that I want. So for my previous layer, I'm going to be adding a little bit of warmer. I want to hear what you guys think. Maybe it is too pink, a little bit too pink. It needs to be more white, and most likely it needs to be a warm red, not a cool red. So a cadmium red or a pyrrole red, that'll do it. So for now, I will take a break, let it sit, maybe for another week. Let it dry and finish up, as we will just jump into painting. Hopefully build it up as far as we can with just a little topic of deeper vehicle texture and brush buildup in order to finish up your painting. We won't dive too much into the color theory as we did today. We'll just go right into painting and hopefully finish it up in our final session. I hope you guys had fun.